Historians of Reddit, what is the strangest chain of events you have studied? We learned about this in school. In the 1950s in Borneo they were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so, with the help of the World Health Organization, they sprayed DDT all over the island to kill the mosquitoes. But the DDT also killed the island's wasps, which helped control the population of thatch-eating caterpillars, thatch that people's homes were made of, and thanks to this, their roofs began to collapse. Many other small insects started to get affected by the DDT, which were eaten by geckos. The geckos developed a tolerance to the DDT, but the cats who ate the geckos didn't, and the cat population started to die off. This led to the island's rat population to increase greatly. And that's the story of how an island with a malaria problem led to cats being airdropped into Borneo. President Andrew Jackson was walking out of the Capitol building with his buddy Congressman Davy Crockett. A man approached them, drew a gun, but it misfired. The man drew a second gun, which also misfired. Andrew Jackson, fairly old at this point, lifted his cane and began beating the would-be assassin. Normally, people would react with justice served, but Jackson was beating him so badly that Davy Crockett had to pull Jackson off his would-be assassin, who was arrested shortly after. The would-be assassin stood trial, represented by lawyer Francis Scott Key, author of The Star-Spangled Banner, and was the first American to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Edit. Crockett was in the House, not the Senate. Zangu Canal. So, the Han heard the kin were fond of mega projects and massive infrastructure investments, so they found a hydraulics engineer and sent him over to sell them on an absurd canal idea. Build a massive canal to use runoff water from two flood-prone rivers to irrigate worthless plains. Tame the rivers, flooding, irrigate wasteland, everybody wins. And in the Han's schemes, it's an absurdly large project that will keep the kin diverted and invested for decades. And it does. Except about halfway through, the kin cotton on to this and confront their hydraulics engineer, Zangu, presumably confronted with whatever creative thingas they do to spies and saboteurs, throws himself on kin mercy. Yeah, I'm a spy. Yeah, it was to sabotage your efforts, but I'm really an engineer, guys, and this will really work, honest. Let me finish it, and please don't do that thing with the cheese grater. The kin, presumably, conclude they can always torture him to death later, and let him remain in charge of the project. And wonder of wonders, it works. Thousands of hectares of rich but fallow desert are turned into fertile farmland. Existing farmland is made safer by giving the flooding rivers runoff channels. The canal makes the kin rich beyond their already immense wealth, which they turn to larger armies, eventually crushing the Han and briefly uniting China. That reminds me of the story of how a Chinese engineer named Zimin Bao proved religion is a con and abolished human sacrifice in China. Zimin Bao was an engineer and a rationalist who lived during the Warring States period in China. He served as a magistrate for the Marquis Wen, who ruled the territory of Wei from 445 BC 396 BC. During that time, the province of Yue in what is now Habe began to decline and falter. The Marquis sent Zimin Bao to find out what was wrong. Zimin Bao visited the main town of Yue on the river Xiang. He was dismayed to find the fertile countryside depopulated. Whole families were fleeing productive farms and leaving the rich land fallow. The peasants feared the capricious god of the river, who could cause flooding and death or alternately drought and starvation, but they feared the crushing taxes imposed upon them by the regional governor even more. Most of all, they feared a local witch who selected maidens from the area as brides for the river. Chosen girls were dressed in finery and tightly bound to sumptuously decorated floating platforms which were then sunk. These human sacrifice extravaganzas were the purported cause of the high taxes as well. The governor levied annual taxes for the ceremony and then kept a majority of the proceeds for himself and his cronies. People who complained discovered that their daughters were chosen as brides. Upon finding this out, Zimin Bao arrived at one of the marriage celebrations with a troop of Wei soldiers. As the ceremony started, he proclaimed the girl unworthy of the river god. He commanded the witch to go down to the riverbed and ask the river god whether the previous brides had been satisfactory. When she began to equivocate, the soldiers threw her into the river where she quickly sank beneath the current. When the witch didn't return, Simon asked the governor's cronies to see what was taking her so long. The soldiers then threw them in the river to drown as well. Simon Bao sarcastically suggested that the witch and the officials were having lunch with the river god. He was about to send the regional governor to fetch them when the governor fell to his knees and begged forgiveness for the scheme. Simon Bao stripped the governor of position and holdings and then probably tortured him to death as was customary at the time. He used the proscribed wealth to build a series of dams and irrigation canals to bring the unruly river under control. Simon Bao is still revered for being the first Chinese official to tame a river by means of civil engineering, cunning administration, and, above all, the ability to see that religion was a con trick. Pretty much the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR was already crumbling by this point, and so they agreed to allow the wall to be opened for a bit. Well, the guy in charge over in Berlin didn't really get the point across to the public very well, and as a result everyone assumed that the wall was permanently coming down. This led to pretty much all of East Berlin flocking to the wall and demanding to be let through. The guards there knew there was no way to restrain all these people without a massacre occurring, and the Russian government had no real way of easily fixing the huge mistake. And so the Berlin Wall fell, all because of a misinterpretation. The events that led and culminated in the War of the Bucket for sure. Essentially, one Italian state who followed Holy Roman Emperor stole a bucket from another Italian state who followed the Pope. War broke out, the papal state highly outnumbered the Her state, but Her state won. Then stole another bucket. Was a trip for sure when I learned about this one. In 1918, British MP Noel Pemberton Billing caused a major scandal when he accused actress Maud Allen and Margot Asquith, wife of the previous Prime Minister, of being at the center of a homosexual ring sabotaging the war effort. Evidence included Allen having performed in a play by Oscar Wilde and Asquith having attended the performance. He presented his case in an article entitled The Cult of the Clitoris, in which he claimed the exiled Prince of Albania had a black book listing all the blackmailed homosexuals in Britain. Maud Allen, who was in fact homosexual, Asquith was not, sued for libel, but lost. During the trial, one witness claimed to have seen the Albanian prince's black book and claimed that the judge's name was in it. Probably how Pepsi briefly became the sixth largest military in the world. In 1959, President Eisenhower wanted to show the Soviet Union how great America was, so the government set up an American National Exhibition and sent Vice President Nixon there. Well, Nixon and Soviet leader Khrushchev got in an argument over communism versus capitalism. As it got heated, the president of Pepsi stepped in and was like, "Bro, Khrushchev, chill out, have a Pepsi." Khrushchev most of loved that shit, because then the Soviet Union wanted to permanently bring Pepsi over to their country. The problem is that their money wasn't accepted throughout the world. Instead, like true Russians, the Soviet Union traded vodka for Pepsi. This was all good until the late 1980s, when their contract was going to expire and vodka would cut it for payment. So instead they traded Pepsi a fuck-ton of submarines and warships for $3 billion worth of Pepsi. Sadly, instead of terrorizing the seas and shooting harpoons at their enemies, Pepsi decided to sell the fleet to a Swedish scrap metal company. Recent history, but it still boggles my mind. Jerry Ryan gets cast on Star Trek. Voyager as 7 of 9. Jerry Ryan divorces her husband. Her ex-husband, Jack, with a really strong resume and a lot of money, announces a Senate campaign in the state of Illinois in 2004. His entry in the race is enough that it is now considered a toss-up. Because both Jerry and Jack are public figures, journalists push for their divorce records to be released, and a major factor in their split was Jack's desire to have sex in public locations. Jack Ryan drops out and the GOP struggles to find a replacement. This leads to an overwhelming victory from the Democratic challenger, Barack Obama. The entire Obama presidency exists because some writers in the 90s wanted a big titty bored girl in their show. As a boxing historian, probably the story of an ancient Greek boxer named Cleomades. Apparently, while in the Olympic final, he killed his opponent by stabbing his fingers into his opponent's chest, killing him. Which means he loses due to a strange and awesome rule was if your opponent was killed by the fight, he automatically won. So despite surviving the fight, Cleomades is judged the loser. No glory or olive wreath. Returns home to Astipalayu and lapses into deep depression. Commits the first mass murder of school children after punching a support beam so hard the school fell down. All the kids die. Angry mob forms to kill Cleomades, who takes shelter in a giant chest in the Temple of Athena. Townsfolk storm the temple and try to pry open the chest. End up having to rip it apart board by board. But when they got it open, there was nothing in it. Naturally, the people didn't know what to make of it. So they send people to the Oracle of Delphi, who declared that Cleomades was the last true Astipalayan and that he be worshipped as a demigod. That is how an Olympic boxer became a deity of fertility after murdering a ton of kids. Royal family ain't got shit on ancient Greek crazy.